Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's always a pleasure and a privilege to introduce our speakers. And today is, of course, a special privilege because he's one of us and he's known throughout the organization as someone that does a lot of research into Tommy Sopwith, Sidney Cam, and Mr. Hawker himself. So we're very pleased today that we're going to hear from David Hassard on a research program that he's kept pretty secret, especially for those of us interested in aviation art. And his subject today, as you see there, is a picture is worth 10,000 words. And I know it's a very personal take, especially looking at the advertising that was around in the days of aeroplane magazines and artists that we certainly all of us, I think, have heard of. Hear from David, not from me. So please, can I ask him to stand forward and tell us all his aviation art. Thank you, David.
The talk's called "A Picture is Worth 10,000 Words." My interest in aviation paintings and drawings is as old as my interest in aircraft. Most of the pictures you'll see this afternoon are from my own collections of books, vintage magazines, prints, brochures, and any other source I can come by, really. When I was a boy, my father worked at de Havilland's at Hatfield, and my introduction to aircraft came from brochures and particularly in-house magazines he'd brought home for me to see. I found the paintings in these even more fascinating than the photographs, like this soft focus Frank Wootton painting of the sleek Comet prototype. To this day, I can imagine being up there with the soft whistle of those 4 ghost engines. Through Frank Wootton's eyes, I saw the sunny future and liked the look of it. His illustrations undoubtedly reinforced de Havilland's image and reputation. There are a few dull grey days and unwanted background distractions in the painter's world, and they're in colour, which most aviation photographs were not at this time. Frank Wootton was equally at home depicting military aircraft scenes on the left here, and was succeeded by other excellent painters like John Young on the right. Terence Cuneo's industrial studies for de Havilland probably had some influence on my choosing a career in aircraft engineering. Despite claims that a picture is worth 10,000 words is ancient Greek or Chinese, I couldn't find it on record until a speech in the early 20th century by an advertising executive. Whatever the origins, reading any number of words would never have left me with such enduring impressions of aircraft and aviation as those early images I saw as a boy. I contend that it would take more than 10,000 words to adequately describe a picture like this next one. To explain the shape and size of each element of the picture and how the sunlight glints off the surfaces and subtly changes colours would take thousands of words and still not instantly convey the atmosphere, the sights, even to me, the smells and sounds that Wilfred Hardy's painting does. What is probably equally true, however, is that creating a picture requires 10,000 decisions, and any one of them could ruin an otherwise promising effort. If you've tried it, you'll know that setting out to produce a painting is a daunting and often frustrating task, not to be undertaken lightly. The subject has to be researched and understood. An interesting composition has to be worked out. Your style must be chosen, the medium you're going to use, your color palette, the technique. And if you have sufficient hard-won painterly skill, you could eventually produce a picture with some impact for any viewer. However, like most things in life, if the purpose of that effort is very clear in your head and some inspirations and originality is thrown in, then the impact is likely to be much greater. I can imagine this painting being commissioned as a happy memories leaving present for a pilot. And if that was the case, I think the painter has achieved his purpose. It's largely irrelevant whether the pictures we're going to see this afternoon are art with a capital A, but some undoubtedly are. To test this, I thought I would search for paintings by internationally acclaimed and recognized artists. Surely most of that would be art with a capital A. I found very few. This earliest one is by post-impressionist Henri Rousseau in 1907 in his naive style. He's included a Wright flyer, presumably from a photograph, as the Wright brothers did not come to France until a year later. By 1910, André de Vombay was seeing the beauty of early flying machines like this Antoinette and emphasizing their fragility in the face of nature. Spot the Blériot monoplane in the bottom left corner. The colorful French cubist Robert Delaunay used stylized aircraft and the Eiffel Tower in his Orphic cubism attempts to capture movement, rhythm, and the play of light. During the First World War, established artists were recruited to record that war. Royal Academician and Royal Naval Air Service Captain C.R. Fleming Williams here pictures a Sopwith tabloid float plane in a picturesque rather than warlike setting, contrasting the technology perhaps. Italian Mario Barbaris depicts the harsher reality of an air battle in dramatic style, while Scotsman Louis Werter uses a different style to depict the dark enemy about to pounce. Interesting clouds. I love the style and colouring of American war artist Bertrand Sandy's watercolours, and these DH-4s bombing Mannheim on Christmas Eve 1917 are an example, although it does little to convey the horror of bombing. French painter Fernand Léger used his cubist style to show the remains of crashed aircraft. He may be making the point about the delicate machines and their ultimate downfall. Royal Academician Stuart Reid produced drawings with this wonderful use of colour to emphasise the drama. In this case, the sensation caused by the first handy page 0400 bomber arriving in Palestine. In the 1920s and 30s, the Italian futurists celebrated technology. In this 1934 picture, Gerardo de Torre attempts to capture the feeling of flying at 300 kilometers an hour above a city. Second World War official war artists included Eric Ravilius, who had been a war artist in the First World War. His Spitfires may look a little strange, but he was clearly attracted to the contrast of their delicate shapes with the brooding force of nature they're about to tackle in the clouds behind. As an art teacher in Eastbourne, one of his pupils had been my favourite, Frank Wootton. Of all the World War II paintings, Battle of Britain by Paul Nash probably has the most impact on me, depicting this huge sky in combat turmoil, the calm landscape below, and wave after wave of bombers approaching from the right. I can't help but spend more time with it every time I visit the Imperial War Museum. Also remarkable is his Totes Meer, or Dead Sea, a seascape of wrecked German bombers in a 1940 scrapyard. Another famous artist, Graham Sutherland, is captivated by odd aircraft shapes in familiar landscapes, in this case, Hamden bombers. And this is one of Terence Cuneo's wartime factory scenes, Bristol Beaufighter production in 1944. An interesting composition with oodles of detail despite the sketch-like overall appearance. Rather differently, John Armstrong forces us to look at form, the shapes of these mosquito fuselage halves, and the workforce, painting them all in that pointillist inspired style. Dennis Barnum sees a bombing raid over Malta from the cockpit of a Spitfire, with a German Me-109 forming a symbolic cross below and a supporting Spitfire in his rear view mirror. Sir Walter Mornington contrasts an idyllic English landscape with swooping aircraft and the vapor trails of the furious battle overhead. After the war, it's difficult to find any aviation depicted in internationally renowned artists. However, Jacques Villon depicted some aircraft, like this weird 1954 cubist painting of an airliner taking off. There may be some works of art with a capital A amongst those, but aviation in mainstream art is obviously very rare. A more rewarding place to look for contemporary aviation paintings is on the posters of the time. This is the world of commercial art or graphic design. And it's interesting in that it picks up on artistic fashions and has its own stylistic progression, blending the pictorial with the written word. Shell Petroleum famously used well-respected artists in the 1920s. Constraints of low-cost color reproduction and clarity from a distance bring new forms of illustration, as in this simple but stunning design by William Dacres Adams, using huge lettering. Airlines were major users of aviation posters, and it's fascinating to see how these reflect or ignore the artistic styles of the day. This early one here is 1925, a bold scene drawn with black outlines. Lithographic posters allowed illustrators to include their own often bizarre lettering. I do feel that JU 13 is about to be extremely overloaded, but we get the message. Equally bold and stylish is this 1926 Imperial Airways poster, which borrows the other popular lithographic device of reversing lettering and background color, as we can see at the bottom. In 1928, a more picturesque style is already drawing us to alluring sunny climes, adding a nice flying boat for the aviation-minded. And 1925, Air Union again emphasizes the attractive destinations and the speed of air travel. American advertising is typically more straightforward than the European, but this is simple and striking. Very modern and effective at the time, I imagine. Some ultra-modern posters in their time now look quite wacky. This is a Danish one. It's rather unfortunate that the distorted perspective makes the aircraft on the ground look as though it's crashed. The Dutch could not avoid adopting Dutch masters style, but referencing the Flying Dutchman as a legend, now a reality, is surely not a great slogan. I remember the Flying Dutchman as a ghost ship that never came to port. Imperial Airways chose the French artist Albert Brenet for their 1930s depictions of the HP-42s. Whilst in France, they were wavering between realism and symbolism. This by American illustrator de Valerio. Excuse me. The Italians regale us with an interesting aircraft and a map with some very fluid script, quite attractive in its way. The Germans, however, choose a Teutonic bold image, a Junkers Ju-52. Aeroplanes scare horses, women, and dogs seems a strange message, but perhaps I'm reading that wrong. In contrast, this Zeppelin advertisement is dramatically artistic, beautifully simple, and to the point. Americans themselves usually go for an obvious image and a straightforward message, but this is neatly done. Sometimes illustrators overstretch the point, as in these very, very high-flying flying boats. Destinations will become the focus for airline advertisements. We see fewer and fewer aircraft as flying becomes more commonplace and airliners less distinctive. There are always exceptions, and post-war, the elegant Lockheed Constellation was a great inspiration to many illustrators. It appears again and again in early 50s advertising, and even the French liked their Connies. As graphic design replaces depictions of aircraft themselves, we see an emphasis on key services and the repetitive use of distinctive logos and standard house styles. Posters for aviation events are another interesting source of illustrations. These pre-World War I French aviation posters may appear charming to us, but offered dramatic novelty in their day. Between the wars, poster design reflected all the trends and fads in art and illustration. This is an interesting Swiss example. Over the last few decades of the 20th century, Wilfred Hardy seems to have had the lion's share of poster design for British aviation events, almost always with these head-on views. There are hundreds of posters to choose from, but I hope this gives you some idea of the scope of what was produced at the time. Another place to find aviation paintings and drawings is in books and magazines. Again, I can only use a few typical examples to illustrate the diversity of styles and subjects. In the early days of aviation, newspapers and magazines used illustrators to make more dramatic pictures than their photographers. Look at a 1908 photograph of Santos Dumont's first hop in the Bois de Boulogne, and you won't see a well-dressed crowd and motor vehicles, or indeed him reaching even this modest height. On this 1914 book cover, the head-on dramatic view has already been chosen, albeit with the aircraft on the ground. And extraordinary machines could be made to look quite practical with the help of realistic scenery and surroundings. Some books appear to have been produced to show off the work of a particular illustrator, like this 1928 Alphabet of Aviation. The text is actually rather dull, but the letters of the alphabet are brilliantly represented in two-color simplicity by American artist Edward Shenton. By the late 20s, stylish magazines like Illustrated London News were beginning to introduce their readers to the delights of flying from, say, London to Paris, and implying some luxury, although they are still all wearing heavy coats and hats in the case of the ladies. By 1929, the Wonder Book of Aircraft uses this dramatic nighttime close-up air-to-air painting. What pictures can also uniquely do is offer fascinating insights to the way some minds are working at the time. Through the 1930s, W.E. Johns of Biggles fame published Popular Flying magazine and the larger format Flying with multicolored cover paintings. I have a significant collection of these. The Miles Hawke prototype is by Graham Percival, and the short Mayo composite by Howard Lee. With the Second World War came a lot of work for illustrators, giving magazines and newspapers newsworthy quasi-photographic depictions of what was happening. And wartime puffing picture books served a similar purpose, using the limitations of just a few colors to create interesting and memorable images. By the 1950s, there were plenty of illustrated children's books about aircraft. This one is drawn by T.E. North, and I've naturally included, bottom right, the Comet Airliner factory page. And of course, the 1954, in this case, Eagle Comet cutaway pictures were some of the first illustrations that I really studied as a boy. Ladybird books have their own particular style and color palette, and there are many editions of this and other aviation volumes progressively updating the aircraft types. There are many fewer children's aviation books these days, but some, like this one, are quite fun and really very informative. In 1987, renowned aerobatic pilot Lynn Williams painted this amazing gathering of aerobatic aircraft for the dust cover of a book, Flight Fantastic, Illustrated History of Aerobatics, basically. Comics are another source of aircraft illustration, and some of them are quite well done. These Commando comics from the 60s, 70s, and 80s are still being reprinted. Recently, Irishman Fear O'Connor found a way to publish hundreds of drawings in his very individual style in a huge but misleadingly titled book, The World's Aircraft A to Z. Misleading because they're A to Z that he chose to paint or draw. Book jackets are an enticement to buy, and this C.J. Ashford depiction of an aerial circus attracted me, however simplistic the style. Equally interesting are lifelike depictions of shelved aviation projects like the 1945 Canard Vickers Type C bomber painted by Keith Woodcock. Specialist aviation books require particularly accurate drawings. The covers of the aircraft of the Aces series are examples like these paintings by Mark Postlethwaite and Ian Wiley. In addition to these books, there are books dedicated to aviation paintings, compilations of various artists, and increasingly individual painters publishing their own work like Evan Ivory here. I shall finish off with paintings from some of those, but first let's have a quick look at technical illustration. If there's one area where it should be easy to convince an engineering audience that the picture is worth 10,000 words, then it must be technical drawings. It's easy to take for granted the amount of information conveyed by clever draftsmen and illustrators, as in this Sopwith Aviation internal arrangement drawing from 1918. By the 1970s, color coding helps when there's a lot more equipment packed into military aircraft. It's not always easy to picture an aircraft from a formal 3-view drawing, but here, picturing the Hawker P1096 project has been made that much easier by airbrushing contours and shadows. A good technical illustrator can realistically depict objects in 3 dimensions and make it very easy to identify things which could be extremely difficult if only words were used. The human brain is attuned to rapidly comprehending complex images and then focus in, an ability exploited by the detailed cutaway drawings many of us will have studied over the years. This is a relatively early one, mid-30s. And I kept this very clear 1947 jet engine cutaway. Because of all the ones I'd seen, it simply explains it all. In this Air Ministry image of the structure of a mosquito, notice how useful color is in clarifying the materials and exposing the shapes to help staff in furniture factories recognize the individual parts they're making for these aircraft. Color adds another dimension. I love this wartime cutaway drawing of a Browning machine gun, not just for its clarity, but the ironically beautiful choice of colors. Someone's put a lot of effort into making the best possible image for what is an official Air Ministry wall poster. I guess most of us are familiar with aircraft recognition books, but there are other ways of getting people to recognize aircraft shapes. Nobody was better at the aircraft caricature than Wren with his identification drawings and poems. You may have seen the Hurricane one, but by 1945, his Hawker Tempest 2 is a more extreme caricature and really quite funny. Wren continued working for the Aeroplane magazine and doing advertisements like these for Esso, which were topical and entertaining. It's amazing how few lines he needs to give us the distinct picture of individuals like Bill Bedford, Stanley Hooker, and Sidney Cat. For some technical illustrators, given a free rein, they can become quite artistic, like our own Martin Alton, who was in Tech Pubs at Kingston. After that very quick look at some technical illustrations, we've got just two more areas to explore. Before the enthusiast paintings, let us skip through some of British aviation industry's advertisements. I have built up a considerable collection of these. By 1910, Thomas Sopwith was advertising his School of Flying at Brooklands using a rather nice drawing of his Howard Wright biplane over the motor race banking. Much more stylized are these drawings from 1916, Whiteheads emphasizing their location in Richmond and being rather vague about the aircraft they're building, and Martinside of Brooklands and Woking with a remarkable minimalist style. It's perhaps slightly unfortunate that the aircraft could appear to be crashing. Advertising becomes more direct when companies are promoting the sale of civil aircraft, but it has to be said the Sopwith advertisements were quite dull. The lovely Airco DH16 drawing takes me up there to see the world in a new way. Picturing an aircraft as apparently from another aircraft quickly caught on, much more exciting than views from ground level. When Hawker got their first government order for woodcocks in 1925, they too adopt rather Victorian ornamentation compared with the very modern bold style that Fairies chose, with white lettering on black background and a smart logo. Get ready to duck. Close-in views of speeding aircraft coming straight at you become a popular composition in the late 20s, as major companies begin to employ accomplished illustrators for their advertisements. By 1929, Art Deco has taken hold with airbrushed smooth, bold shapes. These advertisements must have looked very modern, associating flying with stylish and glamorous living. The 1929 Hawker advertisements were very safe but nicely drawn. Again, minimalist fairy styling looks very daring in comparison. All that white paper doing nothing may not have appealed to Hawker's pragmatic directors, but obviously did appeal to Richard Fairey, who persisted with this style well into the 1930s. By 1931, Hawker's confidence with the heart showed in their adoption of bolder, more dramatic advertisements. And the Hawker Fury on the right works remarkably well in just two colours. It's from 1932, one of the earliest colour printed flight covers I've ever found. By the mid-1930s, Bristol were advertising widely, trying this trendy parallel line drawing technique, whilst Blackburn are trying a fresher style. Signed Morton, this is the earliest full-colour advertisement I've found in any flight or aeroplane magazine, a rather nice two-page airspeed Oxford over Bembridge in 1938. Around that time, Flight started to regularly use two-colour covers like these in blue and yellow. Richard Trevithick's Fairlie Battle is shown over other great British battles. But C. Turner's Blackburn Skewer is a more striking example of facing up to this two-colour challenge. When you imagine wartime austerity would rule it out, Blackburn continued with these coloured cover adverts, mostly in historic, morale-boosting, look at what our machines are up to style. Many wartime advertisements use drawings and photographs. When there were drawings, the Americans, as ever, cram in words with their pictures. Given free rein, illustrators can come up with some fascinating original ideas. Hawker's cartoonist has created a brilliant, strong image of Winston Churchill as a falconer or hawker, releasing hurricanes and tempests to catch the enemy. By 1944, de Havillands were already looking to post-war civil markets and commissioned these nice drawings of Dragon Rapides doing useful work around the empire. Also, before the end of the war, Saunders Roe were cleverly contrasting their military machine with future civil flying boats in these split-page formats. They work well considering they're just in 3 colours. Still 1944, and Bristol take a 2-page spread for their large airliner project. The Brabazon did not retain the elegant simplicity portrayed here by Gardner. Handley Page and Tittenheim with the Arrow York have more realistic and attractive views of their proposed civil airliners based on existing bombers. Advertising styles after the war took some time to settle down. Avro harked back by linking their Tudor with Tudor triumphs. But as previously mentioned, de Havilland looked to the future with bright, sunny, carefree scenes. There was still room for outright originality and simple, striking illustrations like this Meteor speed record celebration in October 1946. Late in the 40s, when most military aircraft advertisements were for sleek jet designs, R.S. Franklin created these really exciting, attractive drawings of the Fury and Sea Fury for Hawker. Armstrong Siddeley and Armstrong Whitworth went for a more painterly style. Cogent on the left uses some artistic license to erase the AW-52 flying wing above the crowd. The tricycle undercarriage was never really that tall. To my eye, he doesn't quite match Frank Wotton's quality on the right. Dunsfold, Terence Cuneo, with his history of factory paintings as a war artist, produced a whole series of these workshop drawings to advertise airworks activities at Dunsfold. But it was the new jet designs which gave illustrators like R.S. Franklin scope for more aesthetically pleasing paintings, even if, like the Saunders Road Duchess on the right, the aircraft never materialized. Roy Garnier's Avro 707 image works quite well. Attractive as it is, the Saunders Row flying boat fighter image has a slightly simplistic children's book feel to me. This is the heyday of coloured advertisements in flight and aeroplane magazines. Lawrence Fish and Jeff Draper get their own chance to celebrate the Comet airliner. Sometimes, however, the illustration speaks for itself. Few words are needed on Norman Jones's iconic contributions to the recognition of the beauty and potency of the Hunter. Fairey's new illustrator, Bennett, uses this painterly loose watercolour style, whilst Vickers and Vickers-Armstrong adopt Quest with a smooth style and interesting compositions. But sometimes, yet again, design simplicity is the answer. Brilliant. Tasked with advertising the unglamorous Alvis Leonides piston engines, Frank Wotton is inspired to devise this unique vertical composition containing all the aircraft currently using such engines, and later dreams up another way to remind us of the continuing value of this older technology. And in technical magazines, a crisp, high-quality, accurate coloured advertisement can be a successful and pleasing addition. Colour paintings are not necessarily the best value advertisements. Much as I like Frank Cross's painting on the left, I think the bold drawing of the Rotodyne has more image to the viewer, more impact to the viewer. From the mid-50s, the quality of advertising images start to deteriorate, an exception being the wonderful Vickers Viscount advertisements, not just by Vickers, but by major component suppliers like Rotol and Rolls-Royce. Some of our most respected aviation painters started their careers in advertising. From 1959 on the left, this is by John Young, And the 1961 Hawker Siddeley 748 is by Michael Turner and for Ceylon, who were just over the road from the factory in Kingston. By the late 50s and 60s, more and more advertisements were using photographs or logos, but where they're not, photographs are not practical, illustrators have always come to the fore. Advertising guided missile expertise is done rather successfully here by D. Bunce. Later attempts to introduce paintings in advertisements, as in a whole series of these ones by two-page ones by Plessy, are not that successful, I don't think. The soft color choices are interesting, but to me, rather inappropriate. I had great difficulty in finding any other aircraft advertising illustrations of any quality after the mid-60s. Amongst the best is this John Young, but even he has been dragged into a brasher, pushy style by the advertising executives. So the golden age of aviation paintings and drawings in advertising was 30 years or so from 1925. By the late 50s, the best aviation illustrators are mixing advertising with book illustrations and individual commissions. There's a strong market to satisfy nostalgia and create in color events only recorded in black and white photographs or situations which could never have been photographed. I call them enthusiast pictures. The compositions are typically dominated by the aircraft themselves and historical and technically accurate. That's a fundamental requirement. There are thousands to choose from, but I'll finish now with a chronological romp through the aviation history of the 20th century, using as many styles and compositions and situations as time allows. The first international flying meeting was in France in 1909. 20,000 people turned out, but it rained and they saw very little flying. The president was presented to the airmen, but probably not in the bright light Albert Brenet has conjured up. Painters have huge advantages over photographers. In addition to the free choice of color, they don't even have to be there. They can choose any viewing angle, they can compact the action, and crucially, improve the weather. In this typically highly detailed American painting, Stan Stokes follows the Curtiss pusher onto the world's first deck landing in 1911. Taking the viewer into an historic event behind the aircraft will become a popular viewpoint. As befits an artist who worked for the Illustrated London News, Kenneth MacDonagh always packed in period detail. Paintings like this are ultimately largely imagined, but they help to bring to life those early days when the few surviving photographs are from the ground and in black and white. When John Cutts heard that we didn't have a painting of the first aircraft built in Kingston for our art exhibition, he generously produced this super image of the Sopwith bat boat against the setting sun, and even inserted a portrait of its pilot, Harry Hawker. In a different style and from a flyer's angle, American Merv Corning recreates the occasion when lost Canadian fighter ace Billy Bishop stumbles across a German Albatross squadron at rest. The historic event in 1918, when Lieutenant Cully flew a Sopwith Camel off a towed barge to destroy a Zeppelin airship way out over the North Sea, has been nicely captured here by American Keith Ferris. And here is David Marshall's attempt to show Harry Hawker and Lieutenant Mackenzie Grieve ditching their stricken aircraft alongside a Danish trawler in mid-Atlantic. Painting murky weather conditions is a challenge not often taken up. For masterly painting and instantly striking compositions, there is Terence Cuneo. He paints these preparations for one of the first, if not the first, passenger flight from London to Paris, which wows at first glance and only gets better on close inspection. A more amusing mood is created by this action-packed American composition by Howard Gerard. Eric Day gives us a much more stylist and stylized treat, just hinting at the background to the fairy fox with watercolor washes. Meanwhile, Alan Fearnley goes for a nostalgic marine oil painting style to capture these supermarine Southamptons in the Far East. Kenneth McDonough again, he did a series of Croydon Airport scenes, here with an Armstrong Whitworth Argosy and Hanley Page W10 in 1929. Note the Junkers 13 taking off. Impressionist watercolors of aircraft are very rare, but Chris Jarvis captures these Bristol Bulldogs in the sunlight with wet and wet washes. Wet in wet, that is, of course. Roger Middlebrook has taken on the Schneider Trophy celebrations and is unusually prepared to include foreground figures. John Young is one of the best known and most prolific British aviation painters, and this Hawker Osprey and pair of Hawker Nimrods is a typical example of his compositions and painterly skills. Ron Belling's book of portraits of military aviation in South Africa covers every aircraft type in South African service from 1917 and depicts many, like this Fairy 3F, with ships and wonderfully painted seas. In dramatic contrast, James Deat is a master of the ultra-realistic American-style aviation painting. It's worth looking not just at the Boeing Model 235s on the deck of the Lexington, but the whole composition. Look at those colors and even the shine on the boots and the creases in the trousers. There are many important events which didn't get photographed. The first flight of the Hurricane at Brooklands in 1935 is one of those. But our own Colin Wilson recreated the scene for us in his 1985 painting. There is a place for slight caricature, nicely exemplified in this all-action John Norris postcard issued by the Post Office to celebrate the valuable part played by flying boats in getting the post around the empire in the late 1930s. This Air France Vibo airliner is another by Albert Brenet. From the foreground Bugatti, the composition takes the eye anti-clockwise around the picture. It all looks so natural, yet he has painted the very minimum required to create an illusion of detail. Canadian Robert Bradford, in contrast, uses clean-cut acrylic painting to transport us to the northern frontiers and show us one of the strange 1930s Belenka lifting strut designs. One of the best-known British aviation and motorsport painters, Michael Turner, takes us up into the action of the 1938 King's Cup air race. There are remarkably few paintings of light aircraft. Renowned maritime artist Ian Marshall has produced a book of his flying boat pictures, beautiful drawings with these soft watercolor washes. John Young succeeds in a very different, more formal style with this Boeing 314 flying boat and Mount Rainier in Washington in the distance. This dramatic view of Hanley Page Hamden's by Philip West is an unusual subject, but I'm not sure about the oversimplified background, oversimplified to me, that is. Whilst Jim Mitchell takes us way up into the stratosphere in 1943 with this interesting composition of a Spitfire PR9 getting behind a Ju-86R. Canadian Eric Allwinkle gives us a very original viewpoint of a Mustang over the D-Day invasion beaches in 1945. But there's nothing soft focus or quiet about Nicholas Trudgeon's action-packed pictures. Most I've seen use this golden sunset color palette and low light angle. These are Hawker Typhoons attacking the retreating German army in the Falaise Gap in 1944. This excellent recent reconstruction of a Hawker Hurricane rocket catapult launched from a merchant ship is one of many Sopwith and Hawker paintings by ex-BAE Kingston technical illustrator Mark Bromley. And there's always value in the immediacy of an on-the-spot sketch. This one with simple color washes is a P40 by Anthony Gross. Renowned for his, Canadian John Connolly takes us behind heroic Canadian pilot Hammy Gray as he attacks a Japanese ship at blank range in his stricken Corsair. And as their return shots whistle by him and us. Renowned for his World War II combat paintings, Robert Taylor here chooses a more unusual view of the war in Ceylon, a Fleet Air Arm Corsair being towed out of the mud by the station Elephant. Post-war calm comes from Keith Woodcock with this short Sunderland over Pembroke Dock. This Eric Day watercolour skillfully captures a group of RAF trainees about to depart, an unusual composition with an arc of people. In another intimate, nostalgic view of trainees, here with vampires, this group at a Royal Auxiliary Air Force summer camp in 1914, painted by Michael Turner. Those who came to Winkle Brown's talk here may remember he was to be the first man to fly supersonically, squeezed into the nose of a Miles M52. The project was cancelled, but Les Vowles has imagined what it would have looked like flying over Farnborough in 1946. In stark contrast, a Lockheed Constellation in Colin Ashford's crisp style. This classic composition is a typical Malcolm route. He tackled all sorts of transport subjects, often published as greetings cards. I have to include this John Young picture for the outrageous composition, which breaks all the rules by splitting the image in half with a flagpole. Those are Westland Wyvern and Hawker Seahawks on the deck of HMS Eagle in Malta Harbour. But John Young can also get it ever so right. This is a Canadian Nordoin Norseman on the Yukon River in British Columbia. Head-on Hardy, Wilfred Hardy, has really gone for the speed streaks in this very dramatic painting of the Fairy Delta II. Charles Thompson's charming picture of a Purcell Provost being refueled becomes even more interesting when you spot top right the first U-2 spy plane secretly landing in the UK. American aviation artists are drawn to the dramatic and the large, none more so than Stan Stokes with this picture of the 10-engined Convair B-36D. But you have to admire the painter's skill, complete with the Grand Canyon, I think. Meanwhile, Mike Mashat has captured the prototype North American Valkyrie at Mach 3 and 70,000 feet in 1966 with a chasing Convair Hustler. It's a contrast to see Michael Joseph's capture of the calm anticipation of flying at a gliding club. Even slower, Timothy O'Brien has depicted the Gossamer Albatross being pedalled across the English Channel for the first time in 1979. Another dramatic contrast, Columbia's first mission, vividly imagined by Chet Jazersky from a particularly unenviable viewing point. Equally close up is Michael Rondeau's pair of Westland Wessex over Northern Ireland. I think you'll have to agree head-on pictures do have an immediate impact. However, Michael Turner follows Sharkey Ward in his Sea Harrier in the Falklands, releasing a sidewinder against an Argentine dagger. Whilst John Hamilton sketches very effectively the conditions on deck for WASP helicopter teams. I had to include the red arrows. There are hundreds of pictures to choose from, but here Gerald Coulson paints a 1985 display over Dartmouth from a very unusual viewpoint. And we all know Concorde images abound in their hundreds, if not thousands. This is one by David Marshall, and it's slightly unusual. Civil aviation paintings are much less common than military ones, and the famous approach through the tower blocks into the old Kai Tak Hong Kong airport is a challenging choice by Ronald Wong. In a completely different style and using the drama of nighttime activity, British-born female illustrator Terry Wofford catches the shuttle Discovery on the launch pad in 1985. There is a certain irony in painting a picture of an aircraft which purports to be well nigh invisible. I'm not sure of the purpose of this painting, but this B-2 stealth bomber is flying 13,000 miles in 2001 to attack Al-Qaeda terrorists in Afghanistan after the 9/11 atrocity. But the picture does serve to highlight the extraordinary rapid development of aviation from those first tentative hops at Kitty Hawk and in the Bois de Boulogne less than 100 years before. However, to finish, let us conduct a practical experiment to see if a painting can indeed totally engage us and even transform our mood. Take a good look at this one by Paul Rendell. What do you see? How do you feel? I get a wonderful, peaceful sense of detachment from the bustling world below. Is anybody still thinking about stealth bombers or Afghanistan? I rest my case. In the aviation world, at least, pictures are worth 10,000 words. Thank you.
I don't know if there are any questions. I can't see why there should be. But I'm happy to take them.
David, you didn't mention David Shepherd once, or
No, I didn't. There's lots of people I didn't mention. I'm sorry about that. I know for those at home, he's asking why I didn't mention David Shepherd, and the short answer is he didn't jump out at me. If any one person in this room tried to do that same presentation, I doubt there'd be more than one or possibly no same pictures that I have chosen. There are so many to choose from. There are just thousands. This is just from my collection. Excellent tour through an aviation painting. I have sounded at how many you managed to collect in so many really interesting styles. I think Dick mentioned David Shepherd because he actually came to Dunstall and took a lot of photographs of the Harrier and then went away and created this sort of heavy three-quarter front view moderate. I think that was the connection there. But the joy was variety. Just amazing. You should make a book of this. Well, I can't because they're mostly someone else's property. I have to worry about copyright. Thank you. sit on selecting the next talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.